Welcome to the Kolbe Cast, episode 240. Thank you for joining us. Bonnie and I are joined by speaker, musician, and author Jimmy Mitchell. We get to find out more about Jimmy and his background, but also get to talk about beauty, silence, evangelization, and his book, Let Beauty Speak. Kolbe teachers and families have been reading and discussing Jimmy's book. But whether you've been following along or not, we're happy to have you along for a conversation with the author. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and chief homeschooling officer for Kolbe Academy.
Today we're visiting with a name that might be familiar to many of our listeners in one way or another. We would like to welcome Jimmy Mitchell to the Kolbe Cast. Hi, Jimmy.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Stephen. It's great to be with you.
Thanks for coming to spend this time with us. It's great to get to visit with you and hear about your book, Let Beauty Speak. We're undertaking a study of the book as an ongoing formation series. Both Kolbe faculty and staff and parents are invited to participate as well. Before I get too far down the road, would you tell us a bit about yourself and help us get to know you a bit?
Yeah, so I've been in Tampa now for 4.5 years, working at this amazing all boys high school called Jesuit, and a very, very special place. There was already all kinds of beautiful things happening long before I got there, just in terms of the culture of the school and the faith of the students and just the mission-driven leadership of our administration. And we can talk all about that. But I was previously in Nashville, Tennessee for 15 years, and that was in part to go to school. I went to Vanderbilt, and then I was even a seminarian for the Diocese in Nashville for some time. And then when I discerned out, I spent the next 10 or 11 years doing kind of a combination of entrepreneurial work with Catholic artists and singer-songwriters, which you can probably tell based on even the title of the book, how much I learned from those artists and from those creatives who just understand intuitively the power that beauty has in their own lives and in our culture. But I also did a lot of itinerant ministry on the weekends and in the summertime. At one point, I was traveling probably 70% of the year doing, retreats, camps, conferences. It was a beautiful life that really screeched to a halt because of COVID, which brought me to Tampa, and I just fell in love with Catholic education, which came as a bit of a surprise because I was educated in Catholic schools from at least 6th grade on and had a good experience. But not the kind of experience that would have led me to dream of a career in that field. And I would say for me, it's less and less of a career now and more of a calling. And so just have a great love for the Lord and a great zeal for souls and a desire more than ever to work within the beautiful institutions of the church to bring, the new evangelization to life. I would say at a certain point in my 20s, I didn't know that was possible, at least in the way that I've now experienced down in Tampa. And I will also say that, I've always had such a profound appreciation for homeschooling. I'm aware of the sacrifices that go into that and also the tremendous formation that it allows for. My sister is married with 5 kids, and up until very recently, they were all homeschooled. Now, a couple of them are in a classical academy. Without having received that classical education myself to the extent I would have liked, my knowledge, appreciation, and frankly, desperate need for it grows by the day.
Beautiful. What's it like to not be traveling quite so much now? Have you grown accustomed to it and as the 4 years have passed, or do you still travel a bit, or certainly not to the degree you did?
I've always enjoyed travel, but I think it was always about the people. I mean, especially once I had, circumnavigated the globe a few times, it became less about where I was and more about who I was with. And I think what I've come to realize is there's such a call in my life to evangelize, mentor, and form young people in the faith that really wherever I am, as long as I'm surrounded by young people, and I'd say at this particular school in Tampa, there's a real particular calling to form the hearts of these young men. Then I'm probably, about as happy as I'll be anywhere. And so I'm realizing that, there's still quite a bit of adventure in my life because every day is unpredictable. You never know what kind of conversation is going to unfold, what kind of transformative moment is going to happen in a classroom or on a retreat. The difference is I don't have to live out of a suitcase anymore. So I think I am used to it, and I've grown to really appreciate a little bit more stability in my life.
Okay. As I've been preparing to visit with you today, I've caught a few podcast episodes with you relaying some stories from your travels and your time spent with the lads at the school where you are now, and just beautiful stories that give so much hope and encouragement to all of us who are hoping to foster these types of relationships between our children and the Lord for ongoing, as we are trying to lay this groundwork in this phase of their lives for them to take ownership of in the next and going forward. So that's been really enjoyable to listen to. You have a mutual friend in St. Ignatius of Loyola here with us at Kolbe Academy. So wondering if you have any favorite stories about St. Ignatius.
It's a great question. I do have a great love for Ignatius. It has grown quite a bit in the last 4.5 years for obvious reasons. If it wasn't for his spiritual exercises and especially his rules for discernment, I'm not sure I would have ever really lasted in the spiritual life, particularly coming out of college, going into seminary, and then being a little bit more out in the world. If I didn't have those, understandings of consolation and desolation, navigation of my own desires as well as circumstances, and how to ultimately feel confident in the Lord's will, I don't know where I would be at this point. So there's always been a debt of gratitude to Ignatius, even before I came to know him a little bit more personally. And again, working at a Jesuit school, you get to know your patrons, and Ignatius is at the top of our list. I would say I now very much see him as a spiritual father. And because of where my own discernment has taken me, there has just been, a growing sort of stirring in my soul towards priesthood again. That's like a wild thing that we can talk about or not talk about today. But I think because I recognize how much more I'm surrendering and sacrificing at this season of life than 15 years ago when I was right out of college going to seminary, I've come to really, really appreciate the whole laying down of the sword at Montserrat. So for those who don't know this story, Ignatius was not far from where he eventually wrote the spiritual exercises. Several days, and particularly an overnight, vigil, overnight kind of vigil of prayer at this beautiful Benedictine monastery tucked away in the hills just outside of Barcelona called Montserrat, is where he laid down his sword once and for all and realized, okay, I'm done fighting for the world's glory and ready to fight for God's glory, for his greater glory alone. And it was a very transformative moment. It was, a moment that kind of shaped the rest of his vocation. And I think much of our lives can be sort of captured by this image, at any particular season and any particular even junction of life, we have something to surrender. We have a sword that we probably need to lay down because it's holding us back from the things that God is really calling us to. And so in my own life, that's looking more and more sort of intense and consequential as I discern the possibility of the priesthood again, and at the very least, a life of celibacy and mission. But even in the day to day, it's like I'm learning that actually there's great joy in the sacrifice. Maybe not in the initial sacrifice, but often the Lord is good enough within sometimes a few minutes, sometimes a few days after you've sacrificed something great for love of Him. He brings you the consolation that you need to know that, okay, that was right. That was the right thing to do. And right now I'm looking at a beautiful view of the Hillsborough River in downtown Tampa, and I've got some palm trees waving and feeling very good about that. And I just spent an entire day in the best job I could ever imagine, the best school I've ever even heard of. And, the thought of leaving all of that is a little scary, right? So yeah, that's part of, I think, the Christian life is constantly laying down our swords and letting the Lord have his way.
And yet you're willing to consider that possibility. Yeah. That openness,
yeah. It's scary, but it's beautiful.
I think that is kind of along the same lines as the idea of bringing your book to the Kolbe faculty and staff in the name of ongoing formation. We're never finished in that regard. I'm also curious about your musical background. I'm a longtime parish musician. I've been playing in church for a long time. So anytime the idea of music comes up, I know you play a lot in your talks, and you mentioned working with lots of musicians. Say a bit about your musical background.
Well, I came to Nashville all those years ago, hoping that I could somehow end up in the music industry long term. And I actually realized pretty quickly that I wasn't happy in that industry, whether I was on the music side or creative side or even the business side. It was fun at times. I mean, I was doing tour management for big name artists right out of college. I was backstage in all these beautiful arenas and other venues across the country, and living out of a tour bus. There was something cool about it, but I found that I liked talking about it more than I liked doing it, which is never a good sign. And so, all that to say, I realized, okay, Nashville might have really appealed to me because of music and just the music industry at large. But what ultimately kept me there was the church, and I would even say the sort of creative community of Catholics that have really formed in Nashville, and now I would say very much rooted there. So I've always found that anybody I meet in Nashville who's an actual professional musician kind of has a way of keeping me very humble about my own gifts. I love playing the piano. I've written a few film scores, but only for movies that don't exist. I love everything about live music in particular. But it's only since leaving Nashville that I'm ever, in even a remote way, the most talented guy in a room anymore. Like everybody up there is just ridiculous. And yeah, I think music is probably one of the first and most sort of intense ways that God started to reveal himself through beauty in my own life. And some of that was classical music as a kid. Some of it was, liturgical music later in life. And then, over the last 5 to 10 years, just really, really getting into film scores and finding a way to incorporate original piano music, ideally with, a violin or a cellist playing with me. But original music even incorporated or interwoven into my talks. I think it creates a different dynamic, and it gives people a little bit of space to just receive what they've heard and ponder it and personalize it in a way that wouldn't happen if I just kept talking. So you can imagine maybe a typical conference or even a parish mission. Sometimes you're given an hour to speak, and it's like a podcast. I mean, the good news here is we're having a conversation, so it's dynamic. We're going back and forth, but nobody really wants to listen to somebody speak for an hour straight unless you are one of the most talented people out there, and there are a handful of those, and I'm not one of them. So having music, having stories, having sometimes even just like multimedia movie clips, that kind of stuff, it's huge for breaking up the flow, but also just giving people a little bit more of a personal touch. And this obviously applies to the classroom when you think about the work that teachers do. It's really important, I think, to keep the flow of any given class period, exciting and engaging and still very challenging for the students.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, the number of playlists popping up on some of the streaming music platforms that are oriented toward studying or, various frames of mind or tasks in the day that I find them interesting how they curated those. I'm not a huge fan of that word anymore, as it's been kind of used a lot, but I find that intriguing. Like, how did this particular movement from this particular piece make it onto this? That's kind of a tangent, but it's where it comes to mind as I think about how you're describing music's role in daily life and how we can make use of it here at home or in the classroom or whatever. So yeah,
that's right. And there's a whole morality to music. I mean, this is a whole nother podcast episode, but we sometimes have this idea, maybe especially amongst Christians, that if we just change the lyrics to pop music or rock music, then it's going to somehow be good for the soul. But it's so much more than lyrics. I mean, it is melodies, it is chord progressions, it is rhythms, it is beats that actually have a way of kind of penetrating our soul and forming it. And the most technical and the accurate language I could use is, music either predisposes the soul to virtue or to vice. And I'm just talking about the sonic quality of music. I'm not talking about lyrics at all. it either predisposes your soul to virtue or to vice, which means it makes it easier to choose the good or more difficult. It brings some order to your soul and therefore some greater strength to your will and clarity to your intellect and even, purity to your passions, or it does the opposite. And yeah, I mean, a lot of this just has to be sort of tested out, I think, person to person, playlist to playlist, because we're all a little bit different. Our temperaments certainly affect this as well. And, as much as I want to love heavy metal, I don't actually want to love it at all. But, I have these moments where I'm with a kid who loves it, and I want to love it for the sake of the kid, but I just can't get into it, because when I listen to it, it just brings utter chaos and disorder and even a little bit of anxiety to my soul. And obviously you listen to, not to throw out some very, kind of stereotypical, counter examples, but Mozart, Bach, Beethoven has a very, very different effect on my soul. It's why those sorts of composers tend to be recommended for study, perhaps even for prayer or any kind of reflection that doesn't, it doesn't necessarily require all of your, attention. Because I think as soon as you're listening to a lot of pop music, and certainly the kind of music that I described earlier, heavy metal, you're done. Like that's all you can really focus in on, except for maybe working out or going for a really long run or something,
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's certainly one of the things that even the ancients just knew, that music just speaks to the soul in a certain way. And so I like that you're, especially we've got Let Beauty Speak, but yeah, I remember hearing particular pieces of music that would today be considered classical, like Wagner and stuff, even though it's beyond the classical, but like the Tristan is an Isolde chord, I think it's called, or something. But it was when I was studying music, I have a little tiny bit of knowledge of music, just very, very small. But it was like the first time somebody played a chord and it was just, it said despair. I mean, I felt the despair that chord was trying to convey to the listener. I thought, I don't know that I want this in my soul. Then compared to like the Mozart or whatever, where it might lift me up or take me down a path, but then it resolves it as well. So it wasn't just this working up of the passions and of this in a disordered way. It was it was, as you were saying, predisposing me to the emotions working the way that they should, according to reason, in a virtuous way.
That's right. It's funny we're talking about this on election day, even though this may not release. We're recording this on November 5th, right? And so we're all thinking about, our government right now. And I'm now thinking about Plato, who said, I don't care about the laws of a nation. The laws mean nothing compared to the music. So if he could have been responsible for anything, it had been for him far preferable to have written not the laws but the music, because that will ultimately shape, the hearts and the minds of a citizenry. And we don't obviously want to take the political conversation any further than that. We're all tired of that at this time of the year. But it's very, very interesting to think about, and it's a beautiful tangent that, hopefully will one day inspire me to write a whole book just on the morality of music. I would love to do that one day.
Yeah, we'll look forward to that. Let us know when that comes to be. And even just here recently, it kind of comes and goes with me. I'm embarrassed to say, being a musician myself, like the idea of just having some particular music on in the background at home can really help set the tone, change a tone, maybe introduce something into the dynamic that is needed at a particular moment that isn't an overt statement. Like, hey, I'm making a statement by what music I choose to play in the household where others can hear it. I'm, of course, for myself as well. But in the context of a family, like what a grand tool it is to be used for good or bad, as we've been discussing, to put something on that is going to that has a very great potential of kind of resetting us in a certain sense, if that's needed, or just setting a tone that we are hoping to strike for the household. Yeah,
that's right. There's no doubt, and it's a powerful thing just to consider even the music that has maybe been a part of certain seasons of our life. I mean, I always joke about a couple of albums being the soundtracks to my conversion in high school, and I listen back every time to those albums, and I'm immediately brought back to, a retreat center in the North Georgia mountains as a 15-year-old, the exact moment where I knelt for the first time in Eucharistic adoration. And yeah, I mean, that's a powerful thing, the way that music shapes the mind, the memory, the mood of any moment.
For sure.
I mean, so I have a great deal of hope in like architecture and beauty and things like that, because it seems like looking at churches built maybe back in the 50s, 60s, and you kind of think, ugh, how could anybody have thought this was a proper place of worship? And today there's a lot of, so when it comes to just physical beauty, I think people are moving much more quickly to seeing like, oh yeah, those old buildings, the proportions, everything that we're seeing, we like that. That's appealing again, even though it doesn't really fit our construction methods, but that's a different matter. But I wonder how much how much more difficult that might be with music. I don't see any tendency toward, I mean, maybe it's just we haven't hit the moment of great artists that are bringing us back that way. It seems like it's kind of blah right now, as far as, maybe I'm just looking at the popular music, but most of the more modern sort of people following off classical that you'll see, it tends to be more discordant or odd rather than beauty from what I see a lot. I could be wrong, because as I said, I know a little bit about music.
No, I think that's right. And there's pockets of hope. I mean, our school down here in Tampa, about 6 years ago, we opened a brand new chapel in the heart of campus. It's a $15 million project where, all 1,000 of us begin every school day. It looks like we just picked it up out of Rome, like a minor basilica in Rome, and plopped it down in Tampa. It's beautiful. The architecture is stunning. And it has a way of really humbling you every single morning when you walk in the chapel doors. And that's a really good thing for 14 through 18-year-old boys. They need to be humbled as often as possible. And that chapel does it, and it's a space that is, truly proper for the worship of Almighty God. Now, our music has also been undergoing quite a bit of renewal. It probably began before the chapel was built, but we have a beautiful schola, almost a boys' choir, and a little chamber orchestra that plays the music for all of our masses, for many of our special events. So I think there's a lot of, we'll say, institutional or localized exceptions. But I think you're right. On the whole, music, but I would even say architecture is still not in a place of, kind of national or even regional renewal. I just don't think we're there yet. You just see pockets of hope everywhere, though.
Yeah. As I was reading through your book, it was clear that you have read Cardinal Sarah's Power of Silence book, and I wonder if that's part of the solution, when we're able to kind of rediscover the silence first, and then so we can see the schola, the beauty of the schola, the beauty of these things. But maybe it's going to be that first clearing away the garbage and the noise, so that we can reset. Maybe I don't. That's probably the way it is, but I don't know.
No, I think you're spot on. I think silence, obviously, to use a very kind of modern, almost colloquial term, it's like a detox, right? So for most people who just get off their phones for a few days, who step away from city life for a few days, I mean, it can cause a bit of anxiety at first until you get into a rhythm with it. And then the real transformation can begin. We take 25, sometimes as many as 30 of our seniors on a silent retreat every September. So it's 3 days, which isn't, anything compared to what your average Jesuit priest does. They do an annual 8-day silent retreat, and twice in their priesthood, they do a 30-day silent retreat. So we're just trying to expose these guys to that great Ignatian tradition of silence. And 3 days is kind of the sweet spot to where it's intimidating, but by the time they walk in the door and they drop their phones off in our little plastic bin, and they realize that they're going to have one conversation a day for the next 72 hours, and it's going to be with their spiritual director, there's actually a sigh of relief. There's a sense of, wow, this is far closer to reality than what I live in most days. And I think, the more we're behind our screens, the more we're living far more a fantasy than a reality every day. And I think, there's a huge opportunity there, whether that's building silence into our daily rhythm, our daily routine, which is really important, whether you're, living with family or close friends as roommates, or even on your own. It's like having moments that are set aside for silence is so key. But then also, I would argue an annual silent retreat for the average Catholic should be a non-negotiable. I get that sounds radical, but there's plenty of opportunities out there for it. And I would argue that my annual silent retreat for the last almost 20 years has been absolutely essential for becoming the man that I am and having this sort of just spiritual peace and depth that I've always longed for. Without those several days set aside once a year, I just don't know how to go to that next threshold in those deeper waters.
Seems like even like a first step toward that is, for me at least, was adoration when I started as a convert, when I was exposed to that. And you mentioned that in multiple times in your life, but the first, like sitting for an hour silently in prayer, was just really hard for a long time. It was, I wanted something to be happening, and I had to just be there quiet. And so, I mean, it seems like even, yeah, there's a first step. I think even just that little step into silence, but of course you're there and you're in the presence of the Lord the entire time. So it's bound to be good, but it's not always easy. I find with people I talk to at our parish too, who are new to that.
That's right.
So your book, Let Beauty Speak, we've mentioned it here throughout this conversation. We've been talking for a while, referring to it. Let's delve more deeply into it. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, I could probably argue it's 10 years in the making. And what I mean by that is the ideas, the concepts, are the overflow of about 10 years of prayer, study, and just lived experience. So I'm thinking back to, talks I gave when I was maybe a few years out of seminary and just starting to get involved in retreat ministry and conference ministry. I mean, some of those talks are even actually kind of summed up or sort of, reimagined as entire chapters in this book. But it took a while for me to see this bigger picture and to come up with just the idea of 10 principles that could bring beauty to the forefront of all of our lives and allow, how we live to become one of the ways that beauty evangelizes best, particularly in this culture of noise and our culture that is so increasingly post-Christian. Truth and goodness as transcendentals, that they've been sidelined. They've been kicked to the curb. Most people won't give you the time of the day to just have a reasonable argument about what is true and what is good, about what is moral and what is right. But there are very few enemies of beauty. And I've seen that in my own lived experience, with family and friends, my own deepening of conversion, my own efforts at evangelization. Whenever I pin people up in the corner and try to debate them into the truth, I first of all don't always win those debates, because there's a lot of bright people out there that I do my best to intellectually spar with, but I don't always keep up, and yet the more disastrous thing is not losing an argument but losing a friend. And with the loss of a friendship becomes the real possibility of the loss of a soul, because you might be the only person that they ever really meet or that they have in their lives that is going to care about their eternal salvation. So yeah, I think there's a time and a place for argument. Obviously that's necessary, but I found time and time again that captivating people first with how I'm living, even how I respond to their own objections to faith, when I do so with a peace and a joy and a confidence that is clearly beyond me and it's of the Lord, it really does kind of get them thinking. And I'm just right now remembering, early in the book, I tell the story of a friend from college who was sort of a very classic Baptist, fundamentalist Baptist that started this Christian fraternity at Vanderbilt where I went for undergrad. Really great guy, super solid, but had never really considered faith kind of outside of Scripture in his entire life, and was very intrigued, at times kind of annoyed with how Catholic I was and almost like stubborn about it. But he used to joke that, I didn't always have the best arguments, and especially early in college, that was true. I hadn't really done a lot of my theological study. I hadn't really even engage much with apologetics at that point. But he said, Jimmy, you always just ended every conversation with so much love for me and also so much confidence in your perspective that it just always left my wheels turning. And eventually this guy, years later, while I was at law school, became a Catholic, and then spent many, many years at seminary as well, and almost became a priest. So it's just crazy to think what the Lord can do if we're willing to play a bit more of a long game, especially when we're talking about our own efforts at evangelization. And if we're willing to not only play the long game, but let beauty and love really lead the charge, so that then they can't help but start asking all the right questions that lead to the discussions, that lead to the arguments about what is true and what is good. Then I think we might find actually that, our lives have a lot more apostolic, sort of fruit to them. And that was certainly the case for me once I finally came into a realization of this philosophy, of this approach to evangelizing the culture that we have today.
It brings to mind at least a point that at least for me, I often like to think about getting something done, reaching the end right away. And when you do focus on that beauty, like you're saying, you don't think of like, I just can't wait until this sun sets so I can finally get through this. So it was making me think, as you were talking about in evangelization or working through something, that's not the right approach to say, I need to get this person from Y to Z as fast as possible. But if you can get them to see the beauty, to see the love, then, well, here at Kolbe or at any school, I guess what we're always talking about when the kids are young, inspiring that wonder, like you talk about in the book, because then they will become active learners themselves. Their mind is opened, so it opens the door to the truth and the goodness that they want to explore, but then they're doing it rather than feeling like they're getting beaten down a path, to this place that they don't understand that they should want to go to.
That's right. It becomes a discovery process, an adventure, even a treasure hunt. I think in my own life, that's always been far more powerful as well. That I've got to learn to really desire something and long for something before I'm even interested in talking about it. And, when we have the fullness of the faith, which we of course do as Catholics, there's a lot to be desired there. I mean, there's a lot to be captivated by. People have to see it in us first. Of course, they have to see it in us first. And then we have to know them and love them well enough to identify, okay, what are the entry points? Every day there's a student or two or three that walks in the door and they just want to kind of pour their hearts out and talk about whatever's on their mind and whatever it is that they're struggling with. And, I'm not always good about this. I mean, today I would say in one conversation that lasted for 45 minutes, I failed. I mean, I didn't tune in and think about, okay, what does this young man most need right now? I was just so quick to defend what I knew was true, and actually maybe for him was the right move because we've got, several years of rapport behind us and many difficult conversations that have led to a lot of beautiful conversion moments for him. But right now he's questioning things and trying to figure it out. But then another student, very different moment, very different personality as well. I think I took this approach of just not so much feeling this need to convert him or to change his mind about something, but just realizing that there's a lot of common ground, that there's a lot of opportunity to just invite him into the beauty of our faith, rather than to feel the need to constantly convince him of the truth of it. And maybe being at a school is a little bit like being in a family. I can afford to play the long game with these students. In my previous work, when I was traveling constantly, and you realize I've got this one shot, a weekend retreat, an hour-long keynote at a conference, you feel the pressure of that. And sometimes that's really good. And that's why you see a lot of people, especially, when they're not living in a particular town, but they come in and they speak at an event, they can be far bolder, and maybe even have responsibility to be far bolder, because they're not going to have to pick up the mess the next day if they've left a mess behind. Sometimes you want a mess, especially when it comes to convicting people of their sin or helping them, kind of cultivate a spirit of repentance. So all that to say, I've learned how to be more patient and to play, again, that long game with family, but especially with young people over these last few years of working in a school.
I find myself very curious about those points of entry also. Like, how do I recognize them? How do I proceed through them? Hopefully finding opportunities, knowing that I've missed several of them and hoping for those to come around again. But I really have a lot of interest in just getting the wheels turning on these conversations and these opportunities. And I find myself utilizing more fewer words and more action, more like putting on a certain playlist that's in the background. I don't say much about it. I just do it. So sometimes it's kind of difficult for me to use the words themselves. I find myself resorting to other means.
It's really good. And that's actually what these 10 principles are. They're 10 entry points for evangelizing souls that have grown up in a post-Christian culture, right? So obviously, I think some of them are more universal. I would actually argue that all of them are universal, but some are going to be so foundational that you can hardly talk about the rest without understanding them first. So, I mean, the book begins with wonder because it's something that all of us probably lost sometime after childhood, that spirit of childlike wonder and awe. I mean, there's something deep down in us that wants to reclaim that, the innocence of our youth, the humility and the gratitude and the joy that comes with just being in awe of ultimately God and all that he has done. And then freedom is something that I think is a universally appealing principle, because who doesn't want to deep down be free? We talk about it a lot in this country, kind of in the political context, but freedom is an interior concept, most importantly. Freedom from sin, freedom from slavery, freedom to be who we are called to be. There's ways to even frame that have universal appeal to every human heart. Friendship, we could go on and on about that, but we are living in probably one of the loneliest moments in our country's history. I mean, it's an epidemic. Quite literally, the U.S. Surgeon General a year ago put out a report saying that loneliness is the pandemic. It is, the big issue of our time. And it, of course, leads to all kinds of issues, kind of in the mental health space. But my goodness, it affects families, it affects schools, it affects everybody. So on down the line, and you can tell as the principles develop, they become more noticeably Christian and eventually very noticeably Catholic. Prayer, leisure, work, community, suffering, mission, culture. There's been no greater contributor to human culture in all of human history than the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, right? And so we have a lot on our side that appeals deeply to people's hearts, minds, and imaginations. And this is a book that's really about finding the entry point that works best for each person in our lives and each season that they're in, because it's also something that changes. When you see somebody going through suffering, of course, like, help them see the dignity that suffering actually brings with it, especially when you help them suffer well, the sanctifying power that it has, the redemptive power that it has, the way that our own suffering has made us more human and therefore able to better empathize with people in their suffering. So there's a lot that, begins very, ethereal and maybe even philosophical, but it gets very, very practical with each of these chapters, with each of the stories that I tell, and even the closing sort of section, which has books. People can dive much deeper into each of these principles than I certainly could have in a single chapter by reading any of those books I recommend. But also the getting practical section allows people to make it concrete, so that it doesn't just kind of inspire them. I mean, I definitely am all about inspiring people, but I want to help ultimately the Holy Spirit, transform their lives, and not only their personal and their spiritual lives, but also their call to mission, whatever that looks like, regardless of their vocation. The Lord really is asking all of us to join him in his great mission, which is ultimately a mission of redemption, and for people to tap into the joy of that, the joy of the gospel, the joy of helping Jesus save souls. There's literally nothing like it. I have seen almost everything you could hope to see in one life. At the age of 38, I feel like I've lived 3 lives in all of my travels, and there's like very few things I haven't done. There is nothing that comes close to the joy of helping a single soul come to know and love and serve the Lord Jesus Christ in this life so that they can enjoy him forever in the next. I mean, this is about making heaven crowded, expanding the kingdom of God every single day. And we do that in our hearts, first and foremost, with our prayer, but in our homes with the family and the relationships that God has given us through family, but also in our classrooms and in our workplace and in our neighborhoods. It's all just one massive mission field. And yeah, what a privilege, what a privilege we all have to be a part of that.
This is anticlimactic after those great words that you were just saying there, but I'm a big fan of Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and The Eighth Habit. And as I was reading your book, I was seeing that like you had taken all of his principles but in a Catholic perspective as well. And they're all there in his books, especially his Eighth Habit book. But what I really love here as well is that your book is so good for opening those doors, because you give your personal testimony, your personal experience, you give information about it, but then you always close with try these things, try to do these things. Don't just read it, but do these things. And then, like you're saying, here's more to read. So I think we've discovered it's a really great door opener for people to really think about these things, but not like way up in the clouds, like I have to read Aristotle or something to figure it out. But no, I can jump in and just start and keep exploring. So it's been a really great experience that we've had with your book, at least.
I'm happy to hear that. That was very much one of my goals, knowing that I could probably just on my phone, pulling out my my list of people on speed dial, identify 2 or 3 true experts on each of these principles, because of just the last 10 or 15 years of travel and friendships that have developed across the church, across the world. There is literally no illusion in my mind that I'm an expert either at living, much less describing any one of these principles. And I think there was obviously a little bit of a timidness on my part when I first started writing this. It's just realizing, my goodness, what business do I have pulling together a book, much less, hoping that it, inspires and convicts and transforms people's hearts, But I realized that might be actually a little bit of a parallel and a little bit of a tale for us all to be inspired by. That actually, our whole lives is just about like appropriating, integrating the best of what we encounter, the best of our friends and of our family and of our experiences, and allowing that to kind of become this little masterpiece that ultimately you realize God is orchestrating. Okay, so maybe there's something very personal about this book because of the stories, and maybe even because of the way it's organized, but there's nothing original about it. I don't think I've had an original thought since I was about 3 years old, but there's something like just really refreshing about that, to realize, yeah, we are all standing on the shoulders of giants who have gone before us, whether that's, Stephen Covey or Pope Benedict the 16th and everybody in between. And yet, in the same way that this book was sort of my gift to the world, even if my mom was the only one who ever read it, our lives are meant to be gifts to the world. Even if our impact or our kind of sphere of influence is a bit smaller than the saints who have gone before us. I mean, Therese is the perfect example of this, and I'm rereading Story of a Soul right now, so she's just constantly on my mind. But let's face it, there's something really compelling about a church who not only canonizes a woman like that, but declares her a doctor and then the patroness of the missions, right alongside Francis Xavier, who's the patron of the missions. I mean, this is the guy that baptized 50,000 souls in 10 or 11 years of priesthood before he died a premature death. I mean, that guy was an apostolic rock star, possibly one of the greatest missionaries that ever lived. But Therese of Lisieux died at the age of 24 and lived the vast majority of her life as a contemplative nun inside of a cloister, a Carmelite cloister. So what's the church teaching us here? That actually sometimes it's the people who have the most hidden lives, and frankly, the people who suffer the best. Who are willing to suffer well and united with Christ the most intensely, that actually bear the most fruit in the eternal, kind of economy of salvation. So there's always just so much to be humbled by when you consider life and all the possible turns and twists that ours could take. But there's a reason to just be faithful to the here and the now and the lives that God has given us and the vocations that he's entrusted to us. And I know that's a big part of what you, I'm sure, encourage and cultivate in your teachers and all those who are involved with Kolbe, but maybe most importantly, your students who are up against so much in the world right now that is telling them you've got to go and be a particular way and have a certain kind of success, otherwise you're worthless. Like, that's just the opposite of the truth. The truth is that we are loved and that our entire lives are meant to be a response to that love, that infinite love of God. And all we can really do is be faithful to however we, sense the Lord calling us to respond to his love.
Very clear that you are an instrument of that in the work that you have done over the years and in this book. I've heard from several folks at Kolbe, in addition to Stephen, one of whom is Nicole O'Connor, who is the director of elementary online learning for Kolbe. They're using your book for the teachers as we've mentioned, as a formative tool for the teachers, a discussion tool, and how much it has helped them reframe how they work and how they are ordering their work toward beauty and truth, and how wonderful an impact it is having, and just grateful for that. As we're coming to the end of our time together, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with us, or anything you're looking forward to? Any further thoughts on the surrender you were describing earlier? Anything along those lines?
Well, I'll just say this. I'm so grateful for the witness of, the teachers that are obviously associated with Kolbe, the families that have bought into a very countercultural vision for education. Just the hope that we all have. And that we all see in each other, that God is on the move, that there's something really beautiful and really big happening in the church right now. And I wouldn't say it's easy to observe on these sort of like grand scales, or even, in statistics and surveys as they come out every few years. But there are pockets, beautiful pockets of holiness, all over the church right now. And there's a lot to be inspired by, a lot to be hopeful for. And we're all a part of that. We're really on the front lines of, I think, a very historic moment in the church, and maybe even in our culture at large. Young people are hungrier than ever. They've never been so dissatisfied with the world. They're just fed up, and they want something that will actually satisfy the deepest longings of their heart, that will orient them towards something bigger than themselves. And obviously, the Catholic Church has the corner market on that. We just have to keep proclaiming Jesus and keep loving the heck out of people as Christ has first loved us. And I think we'll continue to see these pockets become movements and eventually, transform our culture and renew the church. I mean, what more could we possibly hope for or dream of than that?
Love that. Okay, so this has been wonderful visiting with you. We really appreciate you spending this time with us. Our show notes are going to have links to how to get the book for families to read themselves and participate in the conversation that is ongoing here at Kolbe this year. There have been a few sessions already discussing the book that are hosted online by Dr. Jordan Almanzar, who works with us here on the Kolbe Cast. Couldn't be here with us for this recording today, unfortunately. But there are more to come of those discussions that we welcome folks to participate in. So we will have links to the previous recordings and how to participate in the future in our notes, along with, as I said, a link to Jimmy's book, and how to find out more about you and your ministry. We'll have links to several related Kolbe Cast episodes that have come to mind as we've been preparing this episode and in our discussion today. So head there to find all those. Jimmy, thanks again for this. Know of our prayers for you, and we hope to pick this conversation up again here real soon.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Stephen. Keep me in your prayers, and I'll be praying for you all.
Subscribe to the Kolbe Cast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.